Hello, everyone, and welcome to Happy Synthesizers, a podcast about singing robots. I'm your host, Kay, and I'm very excited to be speaking to one Salem Wasteland today. Salem is an expert in all things UTAU, having created an extensive collection of tutorials, rec lists, and covers, along with 3 fantastic UTAUloids. His interest in improving UTAU phoneme systems has led him to a career in linguistics, and he's currently working on a Master of Arts in that field. And as if that weren't enough, he's also tried his hand at digital art, web design, game development, and writing for music, prose, and poetry. I could list even more, but I think it's better to let the Renaissance man speak for himself. Please introduce yourself, Salem.
Hi, I'm Salem. I think you covered most, if not all, of what I do, which is a lot. I'm a bit of a jack of all trades sort of guy. Some might say a master of none, but I try my best.
Better than being a master of one. That's how
So they say.
Yeah, so lots to cover here, but no better place to start than beginning. How did you discover vocalsynth kind of in general, and then once you sort of knew what it all was, what drew you towards UTAU specifically?
When I was in middle school, there's kind of 2 factors here, which is one that I wanted to be either a comic artist or an animator, and the other is that I was very into Warriors, like the book series.
Oh, fun! I read those.
Yeah, I was into that, and this was like the very early days of Warrior Cats animations on YouTube were just starting to be a thing, and so of course I was all about that. And I came across one that used this of somebody's like Warriors OCs doing triple baka. And yeah, and I was like, oh, I really like this song. I want to hear the full version, because like it was it was a short little meme, so it was only like 20 seconds of it. So I went and I looked up the full version, and I found a repost of the Nico Nico PV. So like I listened to the whole song, and I was like, and like the music video has like Miku and Teto and Neru in it, and my thought being, the 12-year-old weeaboo that I was, is this anime?
Close enough.
Is this a show that I can watch somewhere? And so that led me to looking up Vocaloid and falling down the rabbit hole and never recovering.
Yeah, I think most of us in this sort of general fandom space have a similar story.
Obviously, like, Tato is in the Triple Baka video, so I already kind of knew who she was, and I pretty quickly learned through, like, looking up stuff that UTAU was a separate software from Vocaloid, and it was one that not A, was free, so was in my middle school budget, and 2 was one that you could use to create your own voice banks with, and that really appealed to me because it felt kind of like a combination of like other different creative hobbies that I already had. So like I love to sing, I love to draw. I was always like making characters and stuff anyways. And so I was like, oh, this is really cool. I can sing and then I can make a character to do the singing.
And that leads perfectly into my next question. So you've got 3 UTAUloids, Katsu, Hiro, and Toshimi. And Katsu in particular has a whole bunch of different voice banks, but the other 2 have also had a lot of work put into them. So what made you want to develop 3 distinct characters from your own voice rather than like working to manage UTAUloids based on other voices? Like Aiko Kikune and Miss Sapphire has gotten a whole bunch of other people that she manages.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, what sort of drew me into the software in the first place was like this idea that, I could put my own voice into it and then make a character based off of that voice that I did. And I guess I've just never really had a desire to do that sort of process with anybody else. I've helped friends make voice banks and stuff, but it was always like I helped them make it and then they made their own character and stuff for it. I've just always kind of had this attitude of like, for better or for worse, that if it's something that I could do myself, why would I get somebody else to do it?
If you want something done right.
Yeah, you gotta do it yourself. Yeah. I'm kind of, toxically averse to working with other people.
Hey, now that's
so I don't do a ton of collaborating in general.
I mean, UTAU is a place where that actually can work out rather nicely, and proof of point, you have 3 great UTAUs to your name. It's like you want to give the listeners a sort of a brief introduction to each of them, like a little bit about their vocal capabilities and a bit about the characters you've created?
Yeah, so Katsu is my main boy. He kind of ends up getting preferential treatment just by the virtue of using my natural singing voice. So, like, whatever I sound like, he sounds like. Like, I don't do any voice acting for him, so he's not really restricted in terms of, like, range or expression. I also do growl banks for him, so that's specifically I do what's called false chord screaming, sometimes called death growling, and so I've recorded at this point 3 voice banks with that. So he also gets those, and those are probably the ones that get the most mileage from people who aren't me. I think just because it kind of fills a niche.
Yeah,
although
UTAU or otherwise, there's not a whole lot of metal-capable voice banks out there, although obviously that has changed over the course of vocalsynth history. There's more now than there used to be.
Yeah, like there's a handful of UTAU, and then, HXVoc just got pre-orders for him just open for Synth V like earlier this week, I think. So I'm excited for him. Yeah, but anyways.
Me too. I think it's pronounced Havoc, but...
Okay, that makes sense. I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's the risk when you just randomly stick an X into things to be edgy. Like, I get why they're doing it, but just like, Havoc is already a pretty edgy name, but sure.
No, like, that makes a ton of sense, because I've been sitting here trying to figure out what HXVoc stood for as, like, something Vox, like Vox? But anyway, so yeah, I do voice banks for that, and I just attribute those to Katsu also. I figured it kind of fits with his whole shtick of, like, being kind of an edgy zombie boy.
Mm-hmm.
The other 2, so Toasted to Me was the second one I ever made. Originally, they were just recorded in my head voice, but over time I kind of developed a more voice-acted type voice for them. I would describe it as my best impersonation of a choir singer. As somebody with no formal training.
I also have no formal choir training, but I think, sounds pretty good.
Thank you. And then Hito is the third one I made, and she's also voice acted, and for her I just do sort of like this cutesy, nasally type of voice for her. She's definitely had, like, the most dramatic difference between the voice banks that I recorded for her as a teenager compared to the ones that I recorded for her as an adult, for the simple reason that my voice cannot go as high as it used to.
I mean, but on the other hand, I imagine years of practice, you've got much more control than you used to, so it's trade-offs, right?
Oh yeah, and like, I think it works out in her favor because, like, obviously she's not the only vocal synth that's recorded in that sort of vocal style, but I think her having a deeper voice gives her, like, a more mature quality. So she's cutesy, but also, like you said, like a more mature feminine sound to her that I think makes her more unique.
Yeah, cutesy doesn't have to mean she sounds like she's 12.
Exactly. So it's and also I think that there need to be more contralto UTAUs in general.
Oh, absolutely. More contralto everything. Contralto is great.
Please. I love deep feminine voices in music.
Mm-hmm. Your English voice banks were created with the Salem-style CVVC rec list, which is a recording method that you created. But for UTAU newbies, can you give us a rundown of first what a rec list is, and then what terms like CVVC actually mean?
Yeah, so what a rec list is for basically any singing synthesizer that's made using human audio data. So one that's not computer generated and not made using deep learning is going to work by taking, like, a big library of audio files, then sampling those, configuring the samples, and then resampling them in the synth engine. And what the rec list is it's the list of recordings that need to be made in order to make it so that the synth engine can, generate any infinite number of utterances in the target language. That's the goal.
Yeah, so it's like the adequate baseline of phonetic sounds.
Pretty much, yeah. So you try to capture, like, all of the different sounds that exist in a language, and then all of the different sequences of those sounds that are possible in the language or that might occur when singing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, so what does it mean when you're talking about CV versus VCV and all of those?
So usually rec list and then by extension voice banks are named per the type of samples that the voice bank contains. So a CV rec list, which stands for consonant vowel rec list, is going to be used to create voice banks that consist primarily of CV or consonant vowel samples, single syllable samples, very simplistic. Then there's VCV, which is basically taking all of those CVs and then also capturing them with a leading vowel before them. So you'll have a sequence like, rather than just ka, you'll have a sequence like aka, and that whole thing will be one sample in the voice bank. And that's used to capture the sort of transition from one CV into the next CV.
Yeah, sort of giving your CV samples a bit of context behind them. So rather than simply just having ka in isolation, you have the different situations in which ka might be.
Exactly. So you'd have like aka, ika, eka, etc. And then what CVVC is it's basically like taking the VCV and splitting it in half. So you still have all of your CV samples, but they're almost always sampled from phrase medially, so from the middle of a phrase rather than just being in isolation. You also have all of your VCs, or vowel consonant samples, which fill the similar role as the VCV does, where it captures that transition from the vowel into the next consonant, which gives a more natural sound. And then these are also used to capture syllable codas, or the consonants that happen at the end of a syllable. And for languages like English, which have codas, they're kind of necessary in order to synthesize the language effectively.
Yeah, that makes sense. And given English's complexity, that kind of leads me to the things is like, what motivated you to make the Salem style CVVC as opposed to, because there were some English systems that did exist already, right? What made you want to do your own?
Well, I mean, some of the very earliest stuff I did in UTAU was actually trying to make English rec lists, but this was, before I knew anything about how phonetics worked. So I was just doing it, based off of spelling, which, if you know anything at all about linguistics, you know that English spelling is not how it's said.
I almost feel like you don't need to know things about linguistics to know that about English. It's like quite notoriously the
True.
language where things are not said how they're spelled.
Yeah, honestly, good point. So, but English also has a pretty large phoneme inventory, so it has a lot of different sounds in it, and it has pretty complex phonotactics. So the way that the sounds can be arranged is also pretty complex. It has a lot of rules to it, compared to a language like Japanese, which has a smaller phoneme inventory and more restrictive phonotactics. So it makes it easier to synthesize compared to English. But so I'd done, that early experimenting with making my own English rec list and such, which, weren't very good, but I got better over time. And then I ended up taking a little bit of a hiatus from vocalsynth, like a semi-hiatus for a couple of years. And then during the time that I was not active, Painted CZ released VCCV, Delta released his CVVC rec list, and Connor Roy released the Arpacing rec list. And these are all three different English methods. So they're all variants of CVVC. So they all have the same sort of core idea behind them of, capturing like the CV and the VC and etc. So when I came back to like working on vocal synth stuff more actively, I looked at these existing rec lists. I tried out a couple of them. I didn't finish any voice banks with them, but I experimented with them and sort of looked at what they had. And at that point, I also had a little bit of formal linguistics education. And I was just thinking, like, each of these sort of has their strengths and weaknesses, but all of them have sort of limitations in their application, and they're not super flexible to account for things like dialectical variation, which there is a lot of in English. Especially VCCV and Arpacing they use really restrictive phonetic notation systems, so it's really difficult to like account for like if a vowel sound, for example, isn't already included in that list, but somebody has it in their dialect, then what do you do?
Yeah, my mind jumped to Scottish accents, because I know some Scottish people roll their R's, and that's not something you see in most other versions of English, so I imagine it wouldn't be in most versions of the rec list, but, like, what are the Scottish people supposed to do?
Yeah, and, like, especially, like, if they want to have, a variant of R more of the typical, what we call an alveolar approximant is the fancy name for that, is the fancy name for like how I say ruh. But if they wanted to include that and also a trill, like there's no way to differentiate those. So my goal with making my own English rec list was basically like I wanted to sort of take what I felt were the strengths of the existing methods, but then just use my knowledge on English phonology to construct a rec list that both had the capability of being flexible and easily customizable, but also that, you know, at its core wouldn't be some huge huge undertaking for, you know, an intermediate or even a beginner user to do, but would still produce good quality English synth. So that was my goal.
Yeah.
I hope I succeeded. Yeah, exactly.
Best of all worlds kind of thing. So between the rec lists and also on your website, you've got some pretty extensive tutorials for beginners using UTAU, and it would take way too long to sum all of them up for that interview, and frankly, I'm not asking you to recite it off the cuff, but like, as a small nod to that, what would you consider sort of the most important advice for total newbies with UTAU who are looking to get into it?
It's kind of a tough question, because like I feel like I have like a couple of things I could say, and some of them might seem contradictory. I think, honestly, the most important thing is to remember that this is a hobby and just have fun with it. You have people, you know, like me who've been doing this for a billion years and who are pretty good at what we're doing, and you have people, you know, who like contract, you know, like professional singers and stuff to record voice banks for them at this point. And I feel like it's easy to get intimidated and overwhelmed when you're just starting off in it and be like, oh, geez, like my voice bank doesn't sound anything like this voice bank, and then get really discouraged. And same thing goes for like, you know, mixing covers and writing original songs and stuff. I feel like it's easy to there's a lot of talent in this community, and that's great. But I feel like that can make it, like I said, overwhelming or intimidating for new people to get into. But just remember that even for most of us who like are good at what we do, like, it's still just a hobby. Like, we're doing this for fun, so you don't have to take it seriously.
Yeah, for sure. I'm reminded of two things. First, I'm reminded of Adachi Rei seems like a good example of this philosophy, because notwithstanding that quite a lot of work went into Adachi Rei, I mean, if one considers like a standard of vocal synth to be like how human it sounds, you know, Rei is somebody that they kind of created to make sound worse in a weird way, and people love her. People love Adachi Rei. So and then the other thing it reminded me of, an anecdote I read online sometime of a person who was a big Stephen King fan and met Stephen King, was very nervous. He was like, how can I get to write as good as you? And he was like, oh shit, kid, stop worrying about what people like me think and just do something.
Yeah, exactly. I guess my caveat to this advice is also like, don't, it's good to have ambitions, but try not to bite off more than you can chew. Like, it's okay to like work yourself up to making the fancier stuff. I definitely I was always like, oh, I'm going to do this big, huge project and it's going to have 5 billion components to it. And then I would try to do it and I'd be like, this is a lot, actually.
Yeah.
I see other people deal with that too. So also like, it's okay to ease yourself into it. Just, again, I think remembering to have fun with it is the most important thing, though. That sounds cheesy, but it's true.
It's true for a lot of things, and certainly in this field, no more or less than others. So we mentioned Adachi Rei and Havoc. In general, what are some of your favorite voice banks? I know what you like to mostly work with your own when you're doing your own music, but like, what are some of your favorite voice banks just to listen to and hear other people work with on UTAU or any other synth engine?
I mean, it's hard to answer because there's so many that I like, and I like them for different reasons. Just because especially like with UTAU, but also these days with commercial synths too, there's just such a variety of voices out there. Yeah, I mean, I mostly work with my own, or I work with ones that are made by like friends and acquaintances of mine. Maybe someday I'll actually finish most of those covers.
Don't even talk to me about finishing stuff. The folder of half-finished Synthesizer V covers I have is mortifyingly large.
Oh god, yeah. I don't even want to think about how many work in progresses I have going at a given time. As far as synths that I just am a fan of that I don't have any personal connection with, I like Defoco a lot. You know, the default voice for UTAU.
Classic.
of course. But I think my favorite UTAU is probably Sayu Yurika
Oh, I'm not sure I'm
because
familiar with that one. I'll have to look it up when we're done.
she's an older one. I don't remember when her most recent voice bank was released, but she was one of the first UTAU I ever came across. And I really like her design. I really like her voice. So, some of it is like nostalgic fondness, but I also just genuinely think she's a good and underappreciated UTAU. And so she I would probably say is my top favorite.
Nice. So
I haven't used her in forever. I really should.
again, the pile of work in progress is there is no shame in that whatsoever that you haven't used her in a while. I'm sure there's a bit of a backlog, but she'll be waiting for you.
True. I do have all of her voice banks downloaded. As far as other synths, I mean, obviously, like I got into Vocaloid during V2, and then V3 came out a couple years later because I got into it in 2008, I want to say. So yeah, V2. But my favorite, and of course, I like all of the Kryptonloids. I would say Luca is probably my favorite of those. But I think my favorite Vocaloid overall would probably be Micah.
Ooh, that's a nice. Yeah, I feel like I want to say that she's a little underappreciated, but like every time I look up stuff to do with Micah, I discover like a hidden network of fans who are really super into her. So I'm not sure if that's the right word to use, but yeah, go Micah.
I think she's like an underground, I don't know, she's like the Vocaloid equivalent of a cult classic, I think. Like, people who know about Micah love Micah, and everybody else is like, who?
Yeah, exactly.
I think part of it is because she's Spanish language, and that's just like, we're a fandom that's predominantly English and Japanese, and so it's like, although there is a pretty sizable Spanish vocal synth community too, but I feel like there's not as much interaction between like the English and Spanish community compared to the English and Japanese community, and so that might contribute it. Although I think like I like Micah. I mean, generally, like, she's just a really good quality synth, I feel. Micah V6 update when. But she was one of the first ones that I heard where, like, I heard one of her demos a little bit before she was released, and I had that reaction of, like, this sounds like a person.
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever heard, I'm blanking. Oh, Maku-san? Like he has some UTAU and vocalist stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he did a cover of Circus P's Breathe with Micah. And I like it even better than the original. It's so brilliant.
Oh, I'll have to go listen to that.
Yeah, for listeners, I'll put a link in the footnotes.
Yeah, because I don't think I've heard that cover. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah. Speaking of things to check out, in addition to, again, like you said, things are mostly Japanese and English, but you've also made a voice bank for Katsu in the constructed language Tokipona? Am I pronouncing that right? What is that? And what about it appealed to you enough to make a whole voice bank about it?
So Tokipona is a constructed language created by Sonia Long, and what that means is that it's not a natural language, so like nobody is born and raised in a Tokipona speaking community, but rather it was a language that was created as an art project by a person, much like, people always bring up like the examples of like Klingon and Dothraki are like pretty popular examples of constructed langs or conlangs.
I was about to say Klingon as an example, but from what I know of Tokipona, it is like the exact opposite vibe of Klingon.
A bit, yeah. Yeah, so like the whole philosophy behind Tokipona is that it's a really minimalist language, and so like that it has, for example, as pertains to vocal synth, it has a very small phoneme inventory and very restrictive phonotactics, so it's very, phonetically simple in addition to the simplicity and other aspects of the language. And so I think that's sort of the main appeal to it. And for people who are like not super deep into like conlangs, especially, it feels less daunting than getting into some other ones, I think. So it's pretty popular as far as conlangs go, but that's, a niche, a pretty niche community too. Although I don't think it's super surprising that there's overlap between, vocal synth fans and conlangers because of the language aspect.
No, I'm definitely not surprised.
As far as like making the Reckless and the voice bank myself, I pretty much just I had the thought one day last summer that it would be funny to make a Tokipona CV Reckless because it would be like the smallest possible Reckless that was still capable of singing a real language.
Tokipona, more like Toki Pocket.
Right?
That's so stupid.
So I wrote an extremely minimalist Tokipona CV rec list, and then just kept going and wrote like a dozen rec lists like in that afternoon. And then a couple, I guess like a month or so later, I revised them and actually recorded a voice bank with one of them. I don't know if I really have plans to do like bigger voice bank projects with it, because it was really just like, this could be a fun, quick project for me to like take a break from thinking about English.
Yeah, enrichment for the enclosure, variety, spice
Exactly.
of life, etc., etc.
I did want to branch into other languages too. I've been working on a Korean voice bank recently that maybe we'll have a demo out soon.
Yeah. Circling back to Micah, since she had like the extra phonetic capabilities for other language, I always thought that she sounded really lovely in Slavic languages, because I'd heard her used for Russian or Polish a couple of times. Just that's something that I think would be neat.
Oh yeah, I think I've heard a Polish Micah cover that I really liked. I think she does English pretty well too. I've heard her do, you know, Spanish and Catalan and Portuguese also, obviously. But yeah, I think one of the things about her that is cool is her multilingual capability.
Yeah, and speaking of multilingual capability, we have touched on it a bit, but like, you are getting a master's degree in linguistics, and when we were chatting a bit just over text before recording, you touched a little bit on how like your falling into this academic path was influenced somewhat by your interest in vocalsynth. So can you just sort of take us through your journey a little bit, how you settled into the fields that you're working in now?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I already kind of touched on like how I got into vocals in the first place, and I mentioned like a lot of my like really early endeavors in the software, because I started using UTAU in 2011. I was a freshman in high school at the time, and a lot of my like really early stuff that I did with it was trying to make it do English, because like that's a language I speak, and I like a lot of English music, so I wanted to work in that. And then in my attempts to, you know, figure out how English sounds, I just sort of stumbled across like actual resources for English phonology, and sort of learned that like, oh, this is like a whole scientific field, and it's part of this like broader field of linguistics. And not only that, this is something I could like study as like my job. So when it came time to like, I'd mentioned earlier also, like I originally been sort of steering towards going into animation, and so I was focused on doing that in high school. Like my high school offered some animation electives, and so I'd been taking those. But when it came time for me to like actually apply to college and stuff, I just made the decision that I wanted to pursue linguistics instead. I felt, and I made that for a couple of reasons. For one thing, I had at that point heard some horror stories about working in the animation industry, and I had kind of learned through taking the animation classes that I don't have a lot of patience for animating, just because you have to draw the same thing over and over again.
Fair enough.
So I learned through doing it that it was not for me, and so I shifted gears to doing something that I felt I would get more out of academically. And I also like, I just wasn't super keen on doing art like as my career at that point, because it was really like, it's my creative stuff is like, you know, what I do for fun, and I don't want fun to become work.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've done freelance illustrating and did not like it. So linguistics definitely is more for me.
And even freelance illustrating is miles away from being an animator.
Oh, for sure. Like that was just me, like, you know, whenever I need extra cash, I take illustration commissions. Like So I did my freshman year right out of high school, and then life happens and I wasn't in college for many years. Originally, I had been wanting to go into computational linguistics, actually thinking I might do something with vocalsynth, big surprise. But I learned through taking computer science classes that I also don't have a lot of patience for being a programmer.
Now that I can relate to.
So I still do, you know, coding stuff, again, as like part of my hobby, but definitely also not something I would ever want to do as a career. But my time like off of school, I was just, working and doing stuff in my spare time. But it gave me a chance, I think, like really solidify whenever I went back to school to finish my bachelor's degree. That like, yeah, this is definitely what I want to do. So there were ups and downs to that period of my life, but I eventually did go back to college, and I finished my bachelor's degree, and now I'm working on my master's degree.
Yay! That's exciting.
Yeah.
So yeah, like you said, you've kind of made linguistics your main thing in terms of a job, but you haven't, let your creative pursuits fall by the wayside. And there's a few different things I wanted to talk about before we wrapped up. You write original music with UTAU. Like, what's your songwriting process like?
So my music background is that I have been playing piano since I was a young kid. I think I picked that up when I was like 5 or something. And then when I was in middle school, I played trumpet in concert band and jazz band, and also did a little bit of jazz piano. So my music background is in, I guess, beginner classical. But I listen to like, all sorts of different kinds of music, and I used to write original music when I was like, I don't know, middle school, early high school, and then I also kind of took a hiatus from that for a long time, and so I really only got back into that, I guess, 3 years ago, I think.
Do you have any particular process to your songwriting, or is it just sort of like something that is a bit different every time?
So my usual process is kind of, I think because I have like sort of a classical background, I feel like my approach to music writing is a lot less like a typical digital producer and more like approaching it from a compositional perspective. So I usually will start with, like writing out the different parts. Usually I'll start with either the bass line or the melody, and then just sort of like build the composition around that. Sometimes I'll have like specific instrument voices in mind, but I usually will just sort of figure that out as I go. Compared to, like some of my other friends who are also, vocal synth producers, and their approach seems more like, I don't know, approaching it from, like I said, more of a producer angle of like using different sampling and stuff. And I do basically the digital equivalent of writing out the sheet music first.
Yeah, the impression I get from like the sort of, vocal synth producers who like do most of their work directly in their DAW, the impression I get is it sort of seems like they're songwriting and arranging at the same time, whereas the more traditional approach is getting it written down and then you arrange all the instruments.
Yeah, like I will write stuff out on my piano first, and then I'll reconstruct it as a MIDI in my DAW.
That makes sense. I don't write music much, but what attempts I have made have been pretty similar. I don't play piano very well, but I use like MuseScore and stuff.
Oh yeah, like I say I play piano. I'm good at piano. I've been playing, for almost my entire life, but again, like I don't have any real formal training in that. Like I said, I did a little bit of jazz piano when I was like 13, but that's about it. I don't play super impressively, but I play well enough that I can use it for like composition and transcription, so that's fun.
Really, what more do you need? Are you gonna go do a jazz concert anytime soon? No.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm not a performer.
Yeah.
And then I think usually also like I will write the melody and the lyrics at the same time. And so like sometimes I'll start with one and then add the other, but usually I feel almost always it's like a simultaneous thing for me if I'm figuring out the words and the melody at the same time. And I feel that's because like for me as a lyricist, it's important for me that I want the lyrics to match, like I want the contour of the lyrics to match the contour of the music. And I pay a lot of attention to what sounds I use because, like the voice is an instrument, and especially like with vocal synth stuff, it's almost even more so than a human vocalist an instrument of like, so I try to be really conscious of like how the phonemes in the lyrics will play with the rest of the composition. So it's definitely a simultaneous thing for me.
Yeah, sort of the lyrics and melody inform each other.
Exactly. Like, a big pet peeve of mine with like songwriting in general is like when I come across a song where it's like super obvious that the melody was written in a way that was completely divorced from the lyrics, and then they just sort of cram the lyrics onto this rigid structure that they've already established instead of letting them work together.
Mm-hmm. Or, I mean, no disrespect to anyone who does this, but my sort of pet peeve, you see it a lot with people who do trans lyrics of Japanese songs into English, but it drives me nuts when people have it's full of emphasis on the wrong syllable. It's like,
exactly.
Oh boy.
Because, like, in English, we have prosodic stress. I'm probably mispronouncing that word. Prosodic. There we go. In English, we have prosodic stress. So like words have stress accents, and then within larger phrases, we have stress accents. And ideally, you want the loudest, highest, longest part of the melody contour to fall on the stressed syllable of a lexical word. Putting that on an unstressed syllable feels a little weird. Putting it on a function word feels even weirder. So, like, that's the sort of stuff that I try to keep in mind when I'm composing.
For sure. And, like, you can break those rules sometimes, but you gotta know the rules first. My mind jumps to Basket Case by Green Day, which has a bunch of, like, weird pronunciations, but that's lending to the chaotic atmosphere of the song. That's, like, most Green Day lyrics, they are not doing that.
Yeah, and like, and I definitely, I break that. I break that when it feels, appropriate for the piece. Like, there is one song I put out recently that has some deliberate mispronunciations of words in it, specifically to fit what I wanted it to sound like. I'm definitely like, I prioritize sound over word choice any day.
Fair enough. As I recall from an interview or something that I read years and years ago, apparently that was like sort of the Kurt Cobain approach. He cared much more about how the words sounded than exactly what the meaning of those words were. And like, it's Kurt Cobain. Who's going to know Kurt Cobain's lyrics?
Yeah, and I've heard a lot of, almost always when I've heard like a lyricist that I really like, they will have said something to that effect of that it's more important how it sounds than what you're saying. And like, I have 100% internalized that.
Fair.
Obviously, the content is still a factor, but it's like if I have a choice between one word that's maybe a little more appropriate thematically compared to another word that's similar but has, the same vowel sound in it as like something else that I'm already putting into in a previous phrase, I'm going to pick the one with the assonance.
For sure. Well, but although on that note of content, I think all of your original songs you've got on your channel right now are part of something you call the Calico Project. And like, I listened to it a bit while just prepping for the interview, but like, I didn't have time to sit down and analyze your lyrics. So I genuinely don't know the answer when I ask, what's the Calico Project?
So it was kind of like a loose idea I had. I started with like one song that I had written for it, I think in 2021 or 2022. I don't remember the exact year. That song, funnily enough, that hasn't released yet. I started with that and then just sort of grew the idea thematically of like, I guess sort of two factors to it. One being this concept of like, and this isn't, I guess, super like, this is something I've seen, like a hypothetical I've seen posed numerous times of like, if you met a younger version of yourself, like what would they think of you? That sort of question. Mm-hmm. And me thinking about the response to that question is what led me to write the original song for it, which, like I said, it hasn't actually released at this point. Probably soon, hopefully soon. But then also just sort of like really, it's really like an introspective project about like the relationship of the self and the relationship you have with different aspects of yourself, younger or older, different faces that you wear to different people, that sort of thing. I've described it as, it's very personal, but it's not autobiographical. Like, I'm not literally writing about things that have happened to me, but rather I'm trying to capture like specific moments or specific emotions that I've had at different points in my life. So it's informed by like my experiences, also the experiences with like other people I know with like gender and sexuality and mental illness and psychosis and all of that sort of stuff, and how it sort of, jumbles together, and how you navigate, and just trying to, navigate being alive with all of this going on.
The advantages of allegory.
Yeah, exactly. There are layers of metaphor going on that I feel would be kind of cheating if I explained all of them, and I hope that people are able to, pick up on some of it. And from what people have told me, it's like it's always interesting to me, like what different people pick up on in the different songs compared to other people, and like none of it I think is wrong. Nobody's ever come to me with like, hey, I think this song this way, and me be like, oh, that's not what I meant at all. Mm-hmm. But there have been some interesting things, like someone be like, oh, I really like, this part, this metaphor, this message in this song, and I'll be like, oh, well, I didn't intend that, but that's really cool that you got that out of it.
Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of Sinamota's Q, which I found out after the fact that it seems to have been written after somebody who was close to him died, but I didn't know that. So the first few times that I haven't put out a cover yet, but I wrote some trans lyrics for it, so I was looking at the lyrics quite intently, and the impression I got without knowing any of the background stuff was that it was a song about people, friends, lovers, or something who had come to the conclusion that they had to part ways, that it was better for them to like be apart from each other for a while, as opposed to what seems to be the more direct meaning behind it as being more about like a forceful separation, a loss, dealing with grief. So I don't think my interpretation is wrong. I've certainly spent enough time on it, but there's always going to be alternate interpretations because they will be informed by the experiences of the people listening who you have never interacted with and likely never will.
Yeah, exactly. And that's honestly that's one of my favorite things about art. And I think that's why I'm, especially in my music writing, I'm geared towards like portraying things in a more abstract ways because, well, for one thing, a lot of the times what I'm trying to convey, it's like if I could convey it in plain language, I would. But the other thing is like, I think, the interpretation, that conversation between the artist and the audience is like, it's such an interesting thing to me on both sides of it of, what because I love analyzing art, like music, games, comics, whatever it is that I'm interacting with. It's like I'm always thinking about it in like in those sort of analytical terms. And so it's very cool to me that now I'm putting out more of my original stuff and then people are doing that for my own work. Because again, it really feels like we're in conversation with each other, but like on almost like a higher level than when we're just talking.
Yeah, and it lends a certain weight to your work that isn't there until someone else has seen it. Mm-hmm. You can be proud of a song that is completed in extremis, in absentia, whatever the Latin term is, but by itself, essentially. But there is something that feels as if it changes once other people see it. Quantum, whatever.
Yeah.
It once you observe it, it's different.
Yeah. What is it? I don't know, like Schrodinger's cat.
Thinking of things people haven't observed yet, it's not done yet. Your other big storytelling venture is your upcoming visual novel, Night Shifting. So give us the elevator pitch for that one.
So Night Shifting is, like you said, it's a visual novel I've been working on for the past couple of years. I am hoping to release it by the end of this year, if not probably early next year, unless anything crazy happens. That's my goal right now. So the general summary is that it's about a werewolf who is kind of a loner and kind of a loser and sort of stuck working at, like a shitty low-end customer service job. He hasn't had, and he has difficulties like, in his personal life and that sort of stuff. And he and his sister find, after one morning after a full moon, they find a different werewolf who is newly turned and has no memory of the previous night. And so the story is basically about the three of them having to sort of work together to establish like what happened with that situation, why it happened, and then sort of solve that problem while also dealing with the interpersonal relationships between each other and with other people in their lives.
Fun. I love me a good werewolf story.
Yeah, me too, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so hopefully the end of the year, like you said, and obviously working on a degree takes up a lot of your time. But that being said, any other projects you're working on? Anything upcoming to be excited about?
I'm trying to think. I mean, I don't have, other than, I have a handful of more songs to release for Calico Project, and then when that's done, I'll compile it all into, one complete album. Also, a couple of, I guess, alternate versions of some of the songs I've been toying with, and I might put out those. Night Shifting, like I said, hopefully at the end of this year, if not sometime next year. I'm working on more Reckless stuff, mostly just I would like to make some dialectical variations of Salem CVVC, just because right now there's the core Reckless, and then there's one that's tailored to American accents, but I would really like to make one that's tailored to British pronunciation, for example. Other than that, I don't. And then, like I said, I'm working on I'm always working on new voice banks. I'm working on a Korean bank. I've experimented with Mandarin and French and Spanish, and so I would like to put out Polish banks for those too. I have a couple of really silly voice bank concepts also that hopefully we'll put out soon. I don't know. I'm always
April
working on
5
billion things. Exactly, and so look out for. I have 2 of them. One of them will get released on April Fool's Day, so it'll be a surprise.
Hey. All right. Well, busy boy.
Yeah.
Last question I ask everyone. If you could get any singer in the world to record your dream voice bank, the ultimate Salem-style CVVC or some other engine, I don't know, who would you ask?
I mean, that's a hard question, just because, there's so many, good vocalists out there. There's some that I think would be really cool, or some that I think would be, funny. I think if I had to, pick one person, one of my favorite artists and also one of my favorite vocalists is Mitski. I would love a Mitski voice bank of any sort.
Nice. Yeah, that'd be fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, on that happy note, thank you so much for sitting down with me. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you. This whole podcast of yours is I listened to a couple before joining it, and I think it's really cool. I think it's a really cool idea, and so I'm glad somebody's doing it, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for coming out. Yeah, this has been fun. I'll link all of Salem's stuff in the transcript notes, and not sure what else to say. Thanks again. See ya.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Special thanks to Salem Wasteland for joining me today. If you're a creator in the vocalsynth world and you'd be interested in featuring on this podcast, you can reach me at happysynthesizerspod@gmail.com, and we'll see if we can make some arrangements. For the rest of you, please like and follow this pod and leave a nice review if you're feeling generous. It's by far the easiest way to help a small podcast like this gain some ground. You can find the full suite of listening platforms, social media, transcripts, and research sources at linktree/happysynthesizers. Happy Synthesizers is written and produced by Kay Judson. The theme music is Ia Van Polka, arranged with inspiration from Lloyd Duma and Automania.